Before modern kitchens and easy meals, food was survival. Every bite had to be earned, hunted, grown, gathered, or traded. Across ancient worlds, people shaped their lives around the struggle to eat, endure, and thrive. From the open plains of North America to the frozen fjords of the north, to the wide grasslands of Mongolia, and deep into the heart of Africa, food told the story of each people's bond with the land. This is a journey through 5 civilizations to see how they found their meals, how they cooked them, and how those daily struggles built cultures that would last for centuries. The Native Americans. Long before cities or roads, the first people of the Americas learned to survive through balance. Their world was vast, from open plains to thick forest, and every region demanded its own kind of knowledge. What they ate was shaped by the land, the weather, and the rhythm of the seasons. For many tribes, food began with the hunt. On the plains, men followed herds of bison that moved like rivers across the grass. They hunted with bows made from flexible wooden arrows tipped with flint or bone. Before horses arrived in Europe, hunters would approach on foot, often wearing animal hides as camouflage. When horses became part of their world, the hunt changed completely. Speed replaced patience, and the chase became part of their identity. In the forest, hunting meant silence. Deer, rabbits, and wild turkeys were caught with traps, snares, or carefully planted ambushes. Every part of an animal was used. Meat was eaten fresh, dried, or smoked. Bones were turned into tools, and hide became clothing or shelter. Nothing was wasted. Survival didn't allow for waste. Fishing was just as important. In the woodlands and coastal areas, fish were caught using spears, nets, or woven baskets placed in narrow streams. Some tribes built weirs, simple wooden barriers that guided fish into traps. In the north, where the winters were long, fish were preserved by drying them in the cold air or smoking them over low fires. Gathering plants and berries filled the gaps between hunts. Women often led this work, knowing which roots and fruits could be eaten and which were dangerous. They gathered nuts, seeds, and berries in woven baskets, grinding some into meal or mixing them into bread. Wild onions, garlic, and mint were also collected, not only for flavor, but for their healing properties. While the hunt and gathering remained central, many native communities built their diets around farming, especially in the woodlands and river valleys. Corn, beans, and squash were known as the Three Sisters. These crops were planted together in a way that supported one another. Corn grew tall and gave the beans the place to climb. Beans restored the soil, and squash covered the ground to keep it moist and protected it from the weeds. The harvest was carefully stored for the year ahead. Corn was dried and ground into flour. Beans were strung up or stored in clay pots. Squash could last through the cold months. This combination provided steady food, full of nutrients, long after hunting ends. Meals were cooked in simple but effective ways. Meat was roasted over an open fire or boiled in clay pots with water and hot stones. Some foods were wrapped in leaves and baked in the underground pits, a method that slowly steamed the meal and added flavor from the earth. Fish were often smoked on wooden racks, letting thin trails of fire smoke them. Dried meat, especially bison, was pounded and mixed with melted fat and berries to create pemmican, a long-lasting, high-energy food that could be eaten raw or softened in water. It was perfect for travel or when hunting failed. Clay and stone cookware were common in the east and south, while tribes in the plains or the deserts relied more on leather pouches and hut stones. The tools might have been simple, but the meals were far from bland. They carried the taste of wood smoke, fresh herbs, and wild plants. Seasoning came from the land itself. Salt was gathered from natural deposits or salty riverbeds. Herbs like wild onion, mint, sage, and sweetgrass added aroma and flavor. Some tribes used maple, harvested by boiling sap from the trees in the spring. Others used wild honey or fruit juice to sweeten foods. Pepper-like seeds and dried chilies grew in the south regions, and were traded northward. Smoked flavor from wood, hickory, mesquite, or cedar became its own kind of seasoning, giving meat a taste that lasted even months after storage. For native people, food wasn't just survival, it was balance. Every hunt or harvest was treated with respect. They believed that the animals and plants gave their lives so people could live, and so every meal was tied to gratitude. Before eating, they offered thanks to the spirits of the land and the creatures that sustained them. Theirs was a diet shaped by necessity and deep understanding. They knew which berries would ripen after the rains, when fish would swim upstream, and how to store food to survive the hardest winters. Centuries before agriculture became science, they had already mastered the art of living within the earth. The Vikings. In the far north, where winters lasted half the year, and the sea was both the lifeline and the enemy, the Vikings learned to make every meal count. Their world was built on endurance. Cold winds, rocky fields, and narrow valleys forced them to rely on the few things the land and sea could give. What they ate wasn't about comfort. It was about survival, strength, and the rhythm of the seasons. Despite their reputation as warriors and sailors, most Vikings were farmers. Their homes were surrounded by small plots of land cleared from forest or stone. Barley, rye, and oats were their main grains, hardly enough to grow in the short northern summers. These grains became bread, porridge, and ale, the foundation of nearly every meal. Vegetables like cabbage, onions, leeks, and turnips were common, along with peas and beans. In the summer, families gathered berries, mushrooms, and herbs from the woods. Every piece of land had a purpose. Even weeds might be boiled for soup when the times were hard. Hay was gathered and stored for animals, because cows, goats, and sheep meant milk, cheese, and butter, essential sources of fat through the long winters. The Viking household was a small ecosystem, where crop fed animals, and animals, in turn, fed the people. The Vikings were skilled hunters, though game was not always abundant. Deer, elk, and wild boar were prized when found. Birds and their eggs added variety. In coastal regions and islands, seal and seabirds were hunted, sometimes using nets or clubs along the rocky shores. But the real heart of the Viking diet came from the sea. Fishing was constant work. Lines, nets, and traps were used in rivers and fjords. Cod, herring, and salmon were staples, along with shellfish gathered at low tide. Whales that washed ashore were celebrated as rare gifts of meat and blubber. To preserve their catch, Vikings salted or dried fish in the open air, or smoked it in small huts built near their homes. Dried fish could last all winter and was traded far inland. For those living near the Arctic Circle, dried and fermented fish became an everyday meal. Viking cooking was simple but effective. Inside their longhouses, a central fire burned day and night, providing heat, light, and a place to cook. Food was boiled in iron pots hung over the flames or roasted on spits. Clay or stone ovens were rare, but baking bread on flat stones or in covered pots worked well. Salt was precious and came from the sea, gathered through evaporation or trade. Without it, preservation meant drying or smoking. Meat was often salted, then hung in the rafters of smoky halls to cure slowly over time. This gave it a distinct flavor and protected it from spoilage. Butter, cheese, and buttermilk were made regularly. In summer, milk was plentiful. In winter, much of it was turned into hard cheese or stored butter to last until spring. Vinegar made from fermented ale helped pickled vegetables and fish, keeping them edible for months. The northern climate limited spices, but the Vikings found flavor in what they had. Onions, leeks, and garlic added sharpness. Dill, mustard seeds, and horseradish grew easily and were used to season meats and stews. Wild herbs, thyme, angelica, and juniper added scent and taste to fish or game. Honey was the main sweetener. It flavored food, medicine, and the drink that became their signature. Mead, made from fermented honey and water, sometimes with herbs or berries. Mead was a drink for celebrations and trade alike. Ale made from barley was more common day to day, thick, unfiltered, and a full, grainy flavor. Imported spices like pepper or cinnamon were rare luxuries, found only through trade with the South. A few families of wealth or connection might enjoy them during feast, but for most, flavor came from smoke, salt, and herbs they gathered by hand. Food held deep meaning in Viking life. Everyday meals were eaten from wooden bowls, often shared around the fire. But during feast, food became a symbol of power and unity. Roasted meats, fresh fish, bread, and cheese filled the tables, along with the horns or mead raised in honor of ancestors and gods. Hospitality was sacred. Turning away an angry traveler was considered shameful. The more generous the host, the greater their reputation. In their harsh northern world, every bite represented work. Plowing rocky soil, fishing stormy seas, tending animals through freezing nights, the Viking diet was born from endurance. It kept them alive through long winters and gave them strength to sail beyond the horizon. The samurai. Across the islands of Japan, the samurai lived by strict discipline, not only in battle, but in every part of life. That discipline extended to the way they ate. Their meals were simple, balanced, and guided by both need and belief. What they consumed reflected order, respect for nature, and the understanding that food was fuel for both body and spirit. The foundation of the samurai diet, in nearly all Japanese life, was rice. Fields of rice stretched across valleys and plains, fed by rivers and rainfall. Rice farming was labor-intensive, and though the samurai themselves rarely planted or harvested, their entire society depended on it. Rice was more than food. It was currency, tax, and a measure of wealth. The samurai's income was often calculated not in his coins, but in his bushels of rice. Beside rice, farmers grew soybeans, wheat, barley, and millet. These crops offered variety when rice was scarce. Vegetables such as radishes, carrots, turnips, and burdock root were common, along with seaweed gathered from the coasts. For the lower classes and traveling soldiers, millet or barley rice was more typical, as pure white rice was considered a mark of higher status. Fish was another essential food. Surrounded by ocean, Japan's people relied on its waters. Rivers and coastal areas provided salmon, tuna, mackerel, and smaller fish that could be dried for storage. Shellfish, seaweed, and even jellyfish appeared in regional dishes. Inland, freshwater fish were caught in baskets or traps made from bamboo, while coastal villagers used nets and small wooden boats. Hunting larger animals was less common than in other parts of the world. Religious beliefs discouraged the eating of four-legged animals for long periods of Japan's history, so meat was limited to wild birds or animals like boar and deer in remote areas. This restraint led to a diet rich in vegetables and seafood, light but nutritious. Cooking was built on simplicity. Most meals centered around rice, a bowl of soup, and several small dishes, a pattern that survives in Japan today. The soup was often made with miso, a paste created by fermenting soybeans with salt and grain like rice or barley. Miso added depth and saltiness and preserved it well, making it a cornerstone of the diet. Vegetables were boiled, steamed, or pickled. Pickling was essential for storage and flavor. Salt, rice bran, and vinegar were used to ferment vegetables like radish and cucumber, turning them into long-lasting side dishes. Fish might be grilled over an open flame, boiled in broth, or dried in the sun for travel. Cooking fires burned in clay or stone stoves called kamado. Wood was the main fuel, and controlling smoke and heat was an art. Meals were eaten from wooden or lacquered bowls, each portion small but carefully balanced. Presentation mattered. Even simple food was arranged with care, reflecting the samurai's belief in order and respect for what was served. Japanese flavor came from a few key ingredients that transformed even plain rice. Soy sauce, made from fermented beans, wheat, and salt, added saltiness and depth. Miso and vinegar were used for both taste and preservation. Seaweed added natural salt and minerals, while dried fish flakes provided a smoky, savory base known as dashi, the foundation of soups and sauces. Herbs and spices were subtle but rather strong. Ginger and green onions were common, as were sesame seeds, perilla leaves, and mustard greens. In coastal regions, people sometimes used salt mixed with powdered seaweed or roasted grains as seasoning. Sweetness came from rice wine, or sugar brought by trade in later centuries. Before that, fruits, chestnuts, or honey were used sparingly to sweeten food. The samurai valued moderation. Too much of any one taste was seen as imbalance. Meals followed clear structure. Rice formed the center, surrounded by dishes and soup. Chopsticks were used even by warriors, though etiquette required calm and precision. Eating too quickly was seen as rude. Before and after every meal, thanks were given. During military campaigns, the samurai ate what they could carry. Dried rice mixed with soy and salt, dried fish or rice balls wrapped in leaves were typical field rations. They were made to last, not to please the palate. Still, even in war, the same sense of balance remained. Food was treated as part of discipline, never excess. For the samurai, eating was tied to philosophy. Their code Bushido taught that the control of the self began with control of daily habits. Gluttony or waste was dishonorable. A meal was both nourishing and training, a way to keep the mind calm and the body ready. The Japanese diet of that time was remarkably balanced. Grain for energy, vegetables for vitamins, fish for protein, and fermented foods for preservation and health. It was a diet built on restraint, precision, and deep respect for nature, the same qualities that defined the samurai themselves. The Mongols. Across the endless grasslands of Central Asia, the Mongols lived in a world with no farms, no cities, and almost no trees. Their land was open sky and wind, harsh, cold, and demanding. They depend on their animals and the skill to turn every part of them into food, drink, and fuel. Their diet reflected their nomadic life, simple, heavy in protein and fat, and built entirely on what could travel with them. The Mongols were herders before they were conquerors. Horses, sheep, goats, camels, and yaks formed from the heart of their world. Each animal had a role. Horses for travel, camels for burden, sheep for wool and meat, goats for milk, and yaks for both food and warmth in the mountains. Because crops couldn't grow well on the steppe, these herds were their farms, their wealth, and their lifeline. They moved with the seasons, following grass and water. This constant movement shaped everything about how they ate. Food had to be portable, durable, and quick to prepare. Fresh meat, dried meat, milk, and dairy products formed almost their entire diet. When able to, they traded with settled peoples for grain, flour, or vegetables, but such foods were luxuries, not daily life. While livestock provided most of their food, hunting added variety. Mongols hunted wild horses, gazelle, marmots, and birds using bows while on horseback, an extension of their military skill. The bow they carried for war was equally useful for hunting game on the steppe. Groups often hunted together, driving animals into traps or enclosed areas. Fish were less common in their diet, since many regions of the steppe lacked large rivers. However, where streams and lakes existed, they used spears or nets to catch freshwater fish, drying them under the sun for preservation. Gathering wild plants or berries was minimal, but in summer, they sometimes collected onions, garlic, or wild herbs to flavor food or for medicine. The Mongols used nearly every part of their animals. Mutton was the most common meat. Sheep were easy to herd and slaughtered when older or weak. Goats and horses were also eaten, though horses were often reserved for special occasions or when the herds grew too large. Cooking was direct and practical. Meat was usually boiled in large metal pots, producing both food and broth. The broth was prized, rich with fat and salt. It was considered strengthening and often drunk plain. When metal pots weren't available, they used animal stomachs or hides as makeshift containers, filling them with meat and hot stones to cook from within. Roasting was less common but done over open fires, especially during celebrations. Bones were cracked open to eat the marrow, and the fat around the organs was saved for later. Dried meat, thin strips hung under the sun, became travel rations, lasting for months without spoiling. Milk was as valuable as the meat. Every animal's milk had a purpose. Cow and goat milk was used fresh, while mare's milk was turned into arag, a mildly alcoholic drink made from fermenting it in leather bags. This drink was central to Mongol life, served to guests, carried on journeys, and even used in rituals, provided energy, vitamins, and hydration in a dry environment where water could be scarce. They made cheese, yogurt, and curds by fermenting or drying milk. Dried curd was hard as stone and could last for years. It was chewed like a snack or softened with water. Butter was churned from milk and melted into clarified butter, which stored well and was used to cook or flavored food. Dairy gave them nearly everything: liquid, fat, and protein. Even children grew up drinking fermented milk and eating curd long before they tasted bread. The Mongol diet was plain but sustaining, seasoning coming mostly from salt, fat, and smoke. Salt was gathered from the dry lake beds or obtained through trade. Herbs were scarce, but wild onions, garlic, and sometimes dill or thyme grew in patches across the grasslands and were used sparingly. When trading with settled people, especially in China or Persia, the Mongols sometimes acquired spices like pepper or cinnamon. But they were considered foreign luxuries. Their everyday meals relied on natural flavor: the salt of dried meat, the sourness of fermented milk, and the richness of animal fat. The Mongols' success as warriors was partly due to their food. Everything they ate could travel. Dried meat, curd, and arag could sustain an army for weeks. Riders carried bags of dried cheese and lumps of fat that needed no cooking. A single sheep could feed several men and provide tallow for lamps, leather for tools, and bones for broth. Meals were simple, often just boiled meat shared from one pot. Fat was valued above all else. The strongest warriors were said to be those who ate of the most fat, not because of luxury, but because fat meant endurance in cold and hunger. Even their cooking tools were made for movement: small metal pots, portable tripods, and wooden ladles. The same fire used to cook could harden arrows or warm sleeping soldiers at night. To the Mongols, food wasn't ritual or art. It was survival. Their diet reflected their land: harsh, efficient, and unchanging. Yet they showed deep respect for their animals, never wasting what they killed. A good herder knew that his herd's health meant his family's future. Their diet might have been limited, but it gave them unmatched endurance. With it, they crossed continents, outlasted armies, and built one of the largest empires the world has ever seen, all powered by milk, meat, and will. The African tribes. Across Africa, from the dry plains to the thick forest, life depended on the land, and the land changed from one horizon to the next. For many tribes who lived there, food came from what the earth and animals could give. It was shaped by climate, tradition, and survival. Hunting, herding, and farming each played a part, woven together into one of the oldest and most diverse food cultures on Earth. Before farming spread, most African tribes lived as hunters and gatherers. Men hunted game while women gathered fruits, nuts, and roots. In the open plains, hunters used spears tipped with iron or bone, bows strung with animal sinew, and sometimes traps hidden along animal paths. They tracked antelope, gazelle, and sometimes larger animals like buffalo or zebra. Hunts were often group efforts, coordinated and strategic. Nothing was wasted. Every part of the animal had purpose: meat for food, bones for tools, hide for clothing or shelter. In the forested regions, hunting required silence and patience. Small animals and birds were caught with nets or snares, while monkeys or wild pigs were hunted with short bows. Fish were taken from rivers using baskets, hooks carved from bone or sharpened sticks. Gathering remained vital. Women collected wild berries, roots, edible leaves, and honey. The honey gatherers were highly respected. They risked stings and falls to climb tall trees and take the honeycomb, which served as both food and sweetener long before sugar reached Africa. Over time, farming became central to many tribes. In the grasslands, people learned to grow sorghum, millet, and yams, crops that could survive heat and drought. In wetter regions, bananas, coconuts, and cassava filled their fields. Grain was grounded by hand on flat stones and cooked into porridge or flatbread. Herding was just as important, especially in the dry areas where crops struggled. Cattle, goats, and sheep provided milk, meat, and hides. Among some tribes, cattle were more than food, they were wealth, used for trade, marriage dowries, and ceremonies. To drink milk mixed with animal blood was common among herders like these in East Africa, a practice that provided nutrition without harming the herd. Fishing communities thrived near lakes and coasts. Nets woven from plant fiber, dugout canoes carved from tree trunks, and traps made from reeds allowed them to catch tilapia, catfish, or small river fish. The fish were eaten fresh or smoked and dried for trade inland. Cooking was a shared act, done over open fires or in clay pots set on stones. Smoke flavored nearly every meal. Meat was roasted on skewers or boiled in stews. Grain was ground into flour and cooked into thick porridge, a base for sauce or vegetables. Clay ovens were used to bake bread in regions where wheat grew, while in the others, hot coals cooked flat cakes made from millet or corn. Palm oil, butter, or animal fat gave food richness and calories. Preservation relied on drying, smoking, and fermenting. Dried meat could last through long, dry seasons. Fish were laid out on wooden racks to dry in the sun or smoke slowly over low fires. Fermented foods were common. Milk was turned into sour yogurt-like drinks, and grains were fermented to make beer. These processes helped store nutrients and kept food safe in the heat. African food was rich in natural flavor. Salt was gathered from mineral deposits or coastal water. Spices and herbs grew in abundance. Chili peppers, ginger, garlic, tamarind, and sesame were widely used. In some regions, crushed nuts or seeds thickened stews, while in others, ground herbs gave food both color and aroma. Palm oil added a deep red color and distinct taste to many dishes. Where coconuts grew, their milk and oil were used for cooking. Wild herbs and tree bark added bitterness or medicine. For sweetness, people used honey, dates, or fruit. Flavoring wasn't just a taste, it carried meaning. Certain spices were reserved for ritual or special gatherings, and food shared during ceremonies often blended sweet and savory to symbolize harmony and life. In African tribal life, food was connection to family, to land, and to ancestors. Meals were shared from communal bowls, and acts of eating together symbolized unity. Every bite represented effort, hunting in heat, tilling hard soil, or waiting months for the rain to return. Feasts marked births, marriages, and harvests. Drums would sound, fires would burn late into the night, and roasted meat, grain porridge, and honey beer would be passed from hand to hand. In times of drought or famine, neighboring tribes often shared food to maintain peace, an unwritten code of survival in a land that could be both generous and cruel. Across thousands of miles, Africa's ancient peoples built diets from what was near them, and in doing so, they created some of the most enduring food traditions on Earth. They didn't need luxury or trade to eat well. They needed only knowledge, patience, and respect for the land that sustained them. From the open plains of America to the icy fjords of the north, from Japan's misty rice fields to the endless grasslands of Mongolia and the warm heart of Africa, food has always been more than survival. It is the story of adaptation, of people learning how to live in harmony with the land and its limits. Different worlds, different tables, yet the same will to endure. This has been Sleeping with History, where the past never truly rests, and neither do we. please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing.